Okay, I'll get started. Just to start with some housekeeping for today. Welcome, everybody. I just wanted to mention that we have live interpretation in Spanish and Portuguese. That means that everyone must choose a language channel, either English, Spanish, or Portuguese from the small globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So even if you're listening in English, please choose the interpretation channel for English. Also, we will hopefully have an opportunity for questions, but they can only be submitted via the Q&A function in Zoom. If we have time, we'll respond to your questions live. If we don't, we'll address them in a wrap-up page, and we'll send a link to that after the panel's ended. If you're asking a question in Spanish or Portuguese, we will have to unmute you so you can ask the question directly. So just be prepared for that. And finally, the panel will be recorded and a link will be sent to you in the coming days. Okay, so maybe we can get started. Well, welcome everyone to today's panel. It's on strategies for change for women on collectively held lands of indigenous, forest, pastoralist and local communities. My name is Elisa Scalise, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Resource Equity. I'm also the director of the Women's Land Rights Institute, which is an initiative of Resource Equity that's hosting this webinar. The Institute will be running an intensive course on this very topic in early 2023. And our hope is that this panel will inspire you to sign up for that course, where we'll have the chance to dive into each project presented in more detail. I'd also like to introduce Katie Rowett and Kirsten Brown from Resource Equity, who'll be managing the chat and the Q&A functions behind the scenes. And our panelists. Today we have with us Celine Salcedo Lavinia from World Resources Institute, Eileen Wakisho from Namati, and Philippine Sutz from International Institute for Environment and Development. We'll post each of their bios in the chat now so that you can learn more about them if you'd like to. Before we move to our panelists, I just want to say a few words to set the stage. It's well known that women are disproportionately burdened by threats to indigenous, forest, pastoralist and local communities' lands, and that women are less likely to share in the potential benefits that accrue to those who have formal or customary rights to those lands. And this is made all the more apparent in the context of climate change and programs or funding to address climate change, which often take the underlying tenure system and the associated gender dynamics and social norms as a starting place. For example, Resource Equity conducted legal and customary tenure analysis across 17 jurisdictions that were set to receive carbon funding. And in all but one or two, we found that the land tenure system created a barrier to gender equity from carbon funding. What do I mean by that? I mean that the benefits from carbon funding were designed to link to those who had rights to land. And women overwhelmingly did not have rights to land, and thus they weren't likely to benefit from the carbon funding to the same extent as similarly situated men. Likewise, we found that without intervention, community consultations and decisions around defining benefits and those types of things would largely exclude women's perspectives, needs, and interests. Now, we're often told that gendered norms and roles around land and resources and local community dynamics can't change, that they're part of culture, that they're part of tradition, that change is too hard, or that we simply don't know what to do about it. But there is a rich history of practice on locally legitimate change for women on collectively held lands that we can learn from. And this practice shows that the gap is not that we don't know what to do to support women's rights and opportunities, but that we lack broad, sustained investment of time, effort, and funding into that kind of change. And today we have a panel that shows what some of those practical strategies are and what can be achieved if we invest in change for women. In our research on gender and collective lands and a pilot project that we ran working with women on collectively held lands, we've learned that there are some basic features of projects that will ensure that women benefit. And many of these, I'm sure, will be echoed by our panelists today. We know that projects are more likely to work for women if they start with a strong, action-oriented gender analysis of land and resource tenure systems, and that analysis informs the design and the allocation of budget. We know that projects are more likely to work for women if they ensure that there's legal and customary legitimacy for women's rights to land and resources, and legitimacy for women's role in setting the agenda and meaningfully participating in governance. We know that projects are more likely to work for women if they invest in support for women as individuals, women in groups, women in their families with their husbands, parents, and children. And we know that projects are more likely to work for women if they engage with men, with local leadership, and with the whole community around changing harmful social norms and practices that are clear barriers to change for women. Each panelist is going to share some of the strategies that they've used and tested and what they learned worked and why. Our hope is that with this panel, you'll see that change for Indigenous, pastoralist, forest, and local community women is not a mystery and that it is possible. So let's get started. Eileen, we'll start with you. Hi. Can you describe the process that you use to engage with women and to engage the community at the same time? Did you learn anything new or surprising with this engagement?
Thank you very much, Elisa. Before I respond to your question, allow me to set context in a minute or so. So Kenya has a legal framework that provides for recognition and then registration of lands that are communally or collectively owned by communities. This is the Community Land Act of 2016 that clearly provides a framework whereby communities can actually proceed and register their lands. Now, under the Community Land Act, which is pretty a progressive piece of legislation, women and men have an opportunity to all participate meaningfully in how land is managed and governed, and how community land is managed and governed. You see, Community Land Act is not the first law that provides for a framework of organizing and registering community lands. In 1968, just a few years after Kenya attained its independence, there was an attempt to provide for a legislation where communities could organize under groups or as groups. This was the Land Group Representatives Act, which brought communities together and communities registered as group ranches. Now, if you read the history of group ranches were very notorious for excluding women in one membership, but also in key governance structures that existed then. In fact, group ranches had a very weak governance system, and communities didn't have any defined ways of appealing bad decisions of its leadership. So in 2016, once the country passed this Progressive Community Land Act, NAMATI started to roll out a community land protection program that seeks to support communities to secure and strengthen their land tenure rights. These are indigenous and local communities in the country. Now, the community land protection program does not put emphasis on titles or registration process, because for us, even though a title is important, but there's more power in having a strong land governance system. Because if you have a title with weak governance system, then the title could deem more insecurity instead of security. And so our focus really is how do we ensure that communities have such a strong governance system. Now, moving to looking at how we engaged women and communities. So the registration process has phases. One, communities have to organize themselves as communities and register as such, which is such a critical stage because in organizing themselves, communities develop a register. The register defines who is a member, which is so important because who is a member then accrues all rights that come with membership. Throughout this process, what NAMATI does is it deploys community paralegals. And these are people who come from those communities who don't just go and create awareness, but stick in those communities because that's where they come from. And paralegals are equipped with the knowledge of the law, but also with softer skills of how to guide communities. And the exciting thing about what paralegals do is they accompany communities throughout the registration process. The registration process sometimes is very bureaucratic. And so from the start of ensuring that the registers are inclusive, the paralegals help communities ensure that the registers are inclusive, that women are not excluded in the registration process, and they help and explain to communities why this is important. So they have the register. The second process is developing bylaws. This is a requirement of the registration process. Communities are supposed to sit together and agree what are some of the laws, rules that would guide how they operate. For many communities, the formal law, the constitutions, the land laws are distant. But for bylaws, these are their own laws. They sit, describe them, and write them. And so they're very powerful, very close to them. And so what the paralegals do is they support communities in developing progressive, inclusive bylaws that have very clear provisions on how women are included, how in membership, but also in key governance structures. And for, in defining how women are included, they go into details of the different categories of women, because women are not homogeneous group. And in communities, there are certain categories of women, but if you don't have deliberate provisions, then they easily fall off. They have the register, they have the bylaws, they move now to electing the community land management committees, which is like a governance structure within the community. Kenya has an affirmative action, which ideally means that at least two-thirds in any elective body should not be of one gender. So it loosely translates to, for many communities here, that at least 30% should be women. And so what the paralegals do is support women run for these positions, these are elective positions, and help communities appreciate that this is such a strong compliance issue that if they do not meet that requirement, then ideally they won't go through the registration process. So you see, throughout this process, there's such a deliberate effort to ensure that as we build the register, as we develop the bylaws, as we do the elections, that women are a key focus throughout the registration process. The other thing that we do is roll out a women land rights study before we engage a community. This is important because communities are not the same. The cultural beliefs and values are different. And so in rolling out the study and understanding the specific beliefs dynamics, then our interventions are then tailored with that knowledge in mind. The last thing that we do is ensuring that throughout this process, we are deliberate about monitoring. Because even though we have, as I said, the Community Land Act is progressive, but laws don't implement themselves in the way we desire. So in monitoring, then we're able to zoom through and see specific aspects that need to either be refined, and that becomes a push at the systemic level. So for instance, we've recently just concluded a monitoring exercise where we looked at 17 communities that have registered or are in the process of going through the registration process, and looked at what has the process been for women, what are some of the challenges for women, and some of the findings are not very surprising, but make you stop and think through a number of things. So for instance, most communities or all communities interpreted the affirmative action to ensuring that just 30% is spared for women. And so if you look at all the 17 that we looked at, it's only 30% representation of women that was secured. If you looked at membership, even though the law is very clear on inclusion, and Kenya, if you look at our statistics, we have more women than men. If you look at the register, the reflection is not the same. There's progress because you can clearly see women in the register, but then it's not all women. And so in zooming through the register, for instance, among the questions we are asking is which categories of women are falling off the registration process? Is it unmarried women? Is it women with daughters? Is it women with low literacy level? And in understanding which categories, and we also ask why are they falling off? and what strategies can we then use to be able to ensure that we do not see, we progressively see a more inclusive register. We've seen quite interesting progress. A case is a community called Mosul that previously had about 300 households as members in the previous regime. Out of the 300, only 4 were women. These were widowed or unmarried women. Today, Mosul has over 100 women. So it's not 50-50 still, which is the ideal representation based on our population, but just the progress that will move from 4 to over 100 is good progress. So in terms of some of the surprising things is just the fact that affirmative action does not necessarily translate to progressive inclusion as envisioned. There's still much more that needs to be done. And even where we have very comprehensive piece of legislations like we have in the Community Land Act, there's much more need to ensure that monitoring is done, and there's push towards causing systems, processes, procedures to respond to the very specific dynamics that women go through. And then the other thing that we learned is how powerful women are as an agency when supported to organize. Throughout the process, we've seen efforts where women were supported to organize, and they had spaces to engage with duty bearers, with ministry officials, and they articulated some of their concerns of the registration process in such high level of clarity. And they had they received attention because of just that journey of ensuring that they are supported to understand the law, use the law, and in this case to be able to engage duty bearers. And lastly for us is when talking about women within collectives, is being able to shift the conversation from ownership, which is important because an ownership asks who owns the land. But for collectives, for us, is shifting it to asking who controls the land, because then in control, then you look at women in membership, but also in key decision-making bodies, which is critical, and that's where power comes from within collectives. I'll pause there, Elisa. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eileen. And Philippine, did you have a follow-up question for Eileen?
Thanks to Lisa, and thank you, Eileen, for that. That really resonates with our work as well. But yeah, I was wondering, so did you actually change the project design or the project assumptions as you were delivering it? And if so, what prompted the change, and what change was made, and how effective was it?
Thanks, Philippine. We did make a number of changes along the way because, as we walk through, then we learn a number of things that then inform our program. And so, for instance, we have spaces for women in leadership. These are new spaces. These are spaces that were preserved of men before. Now there's a space for them to be able to engage and participate in decision making. How do they engage in such spaces that are unfamiliar to them? And so, you just don't create spaces because they are creation of law without necessarily equipping women and women leaders in this case with the skills to be able to engage in these previously male-dominated spaces. And so with that knowledge in mind, one of the things that we have done in the recent months is set up what we're calling Women Leadership Bootcamp, which is specifically a space for women who are now leaders within the community land management committees. And we're calling them safe spaces because women are coming together to say, this is the first time that we've been in this space. This is some of the challenges that we're going through. And these are women from different communities. And so the space, through this space, one is just being able to get more understanding of the law, the processes that are provided within the law, but going beyond the law to softer skills. How do you swim through spaces that previously were very male dominated? To date, they still are. You still have just that 30% of women. How do you push some of the progressive women agendas within these spaces? How do you pull and get allies from other committee members who are men to ensure that decisions that then benefit women see the light of day? The other thing is just beyond the monitoring, we are now deliberate into having in-depth studies that allow us to monitor like women leaders from the first women leadership bootcamp to see how some of those capacity building initiatives translates to some of tangible results for them as leaders within their community. And so, not just assuming that empowerment translates to progress, but being able to really monitor and document that journey to see how change happens among these women leaders in the land governance structures. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eileen. We'll move over now to hear from Celine. Celine, could you tell us a little bit about some of the findings in your research? Specifically, other than direct recognition of women's land rights, what types of interventions did you find helpful in creating an enabling environment for realizing those rights in practice?
Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. Well, first of all, it's a privilege to be here. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So let me start by saying that I'll be answering this question based on the joint research that the World Resources Institute and Resource Equity conducted on women's collective land rights. So this research, hopefully the link will be provided in the chat, consisted of case studies of diverse communities that demonstrate practices and interventions that help catalyze women's land rights. And importantly, their abilities to exercise those rights. We studied 5 communities in 5 countries, 2 of which were formally registered forest collective user groups in Cameroon and Nepal. 2 are indigenous communities in Indonesia and Mexico, and a pastoral community in Jordan. So for context, the case study analysis consisted of 2 tiers. The first was an examination of the scope and extent of women's land rights in each of the 5 communities. We looked at the extent of recognition of rights or tenure legitimacy and the enforceability of these rights. Sometimes it's called the robustness dimension of women's land rights. We also looked at the right to access, the right to manage, the right to benefit from the land. And as Eileen has already alluded to, the right to co-govern collective resources, land and natural resources. And we also looked at the right of women to retain the land, even in the event of a civil status or marital change. So these are important for widows, for example. So that's the first tier. I won't delve into that deeply because the response to the question is with respect to the second tier of our analysis, which consisted of teasing out the factors and conditions that enabled women to claim and exercise the land rights that were accorded to them. So our analysis revealed a number of factors at work, which we organized into 2 sets. The first are structural or institutional factors, and the second are operational factors. So these 2 sets of factors interact with each other at different levels, and they exert different degrees of influence on women's tenure security. It's very contextual. That said, you may have deduced already that the structural factors provide the basis for women's collective land rights. It's a structure. So these consist of formal land laws explicitly granting land rights to women in the collective. An example would be the Tanzania Village Land Act, which grant rights to villages and women to have their own individual rights within village land. It also consists of policies or laws devolving management to state forests to local communities with explicit mandates for gender inclusion. This would be the case of our Cameroon and Nepal case studies. And less commonly, a structural factor are customary tenure or inheritance rules that are favorable to women. So this was the case with our Indonesia community, which has a matrilineal inheritance or tenure system. So unfortunately, we found that most of the time, the grant of rights under the law do not automatically translate in practice for women. Eileen already mentioned this. The case studies demonstrated what we classify as operational level factors, or the factors that serve as catalysts for realizing rights in practice. So here I will highlight three particular interventions that created those enabling environments for women. The first would be interventions that empower women economically. So in Jordan and Nepal, interventions related to natural resource management included the creation of collective enterprises for women in the community. Um, in those two communities, in those two countries, they both consisted of gathering, processing, and marketing of non-timber forest products, herbs and wild fruits, respectively. And what this did, the collective enterprise, was to allow women to earn independent income, to contribute financially to the household, and to expand the community's livelihood base. At the same time, women increased their skills, their confidence, and bargaining position, which in turn increased their capacity to claim greater access to household and community resources and decision-making arenas within the community. So women started to be seen as having valuable contributions to make in the management of collective lands and resources. In Jordan, to illustrate, as women earned income from the herbs grown in the pasture, their knowledge of the vegetation and tree cover, which they knew well because grazing livestock was part of their domestic duties, became recognized as important in the efforts to regenerate pasture land. While in Nepal, the women's collective enterprise became successful. Admittedly, this was pre-COVID, prompting the men in the community to ask to join. So the enterprise became one of the main livelihoods based in the community, increasing the women's voice in the forest user group, the group charged with governance of the collectively held forests. A second type of intervention is gender sensitization and awareness raising activities. These were demonstrated in Cameroon and Jordan. In Cameroon, an NGO assisting the community to secure formal forest rights. In state forests, conducted an awareness raising campaign for both women and men regarding the mandate of women's inclusion in community forest associations. You probably know more than me about this, Elisa, because you were the one who went to Cameroon for this study. So what this did is enable women not only to claim their right to become members of the newly created forest association, but also made the men more aware and more open to the idea of women as officers of the association. It was a mandate. And which they didn't know before. And, sensitization activities allowed some openness to the idea. Another example is in Jordan, where National Women's NGO conducted gender sensitization activities using a culturally sensitive approach to open up the highly conservative community to the benefits of women working outside the home and their inclusion in pasture land management, allowing women to claim rights in a way that was not threatening to men. So the third intervention would be building women's capacities to help socially empower them. Again, Eileen has alluded to this. So in Nepal, the hiring of women as community facilitators in NGO projects gave them new proficiencies, such as conducting surveys, information gathering, record keeping, and even basic computer literacy. So the women gained experience in dealing with different types of people, they going door to door, and in speaking up. And these skills and exposure increased their capabilities and confidence to assert their views in the community forestry user group. In fact, one of the women who served as project facilitator is considering a run for the chairmanship of the forest user group when the current chair retires. In Mexico, assigning women to working groups created by the village governance bodies such as school, health, and social action committees improve their leadership skills and technical knowledge and help shift attitudes on their capabilities. It also provided them exposure and experience in public affairs and allowing them to aspire for positions in municipal and communal land governance bodies in the future. So I'm running out of time. I have simplified the examples in the interest of time. You can find more details in our report, but I'll end by saying and noting that what clearly emerged from our research is that interventions not directly related to land played pivotal roles in tackling those deeply entrenched beliefs and customs that would have made it hard for women to exercise their land rights. So this shows that policies and interventions aimed at structural changes must always be coupled with interventions or actions at the operational level. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Celine. Another rich presentation there. Eileen, did you have a follow-up?
Sure. Thank you so much, Celine. I think that's really exciting. I was just wondering whether across the different countries, as you did this research, whether women played a more defined role in advancing their own land rights, or they sort of sat at a more passive, beneficial position.
Thank you for the question, Eileen. That's a great question. I will start with the second part, whether women were merely passive beneficiaries. And I would say that the answer is a resounding no. The contrary, our research shows that women were quite active participants and played vital roles in advancing their land rights and their empowerment. So a brilliant example I'd like to share is our Mexico case study. In the community, women had equal rights to co-govern communal lands, which was granted by the law. But the custom in this indigenous community and the lack of experience of women prevented them from assuming governance roles. A single mother and head of the household blazed the trail for other women by proactively going to the community assembly head and asking to join the meetings. And so she joined by herself alone for a few years. And she then asked to be able to volunteer her time to serve in the community governance bodies. And this was at the time when only men were involved in public affairs. So she eventually became one of two women who were the first in the community to be elected to leadership positions, becoming a secretary in the Oversight Council, one of the two executive organs managing the communal lands. So admittedly, this is not a senior decision-making position, but at least she has served as a torchbearer and role model for other women in the community. In fact, some other female heads of household gradually followed suit and also asked to participate in assembly meetings because they didn't have husbands to represent them. So apart from that, we also found that women leveraged the resources at their disposal to create favorable conditions for their empowerment. In Jordan, a senior woman who was respected in the community capitalized on her seniority and influence, and together with the NGO, helping them help convince the tribal leader to play a part in a gender sensitization campaign that helped change some of the restrictive norms against women's membership in the pasture association and from working outside the house, which allowed the establishment of the collective enterprise, which then snowballed into more rights for them. So we also found that in all 5 communities, women volunteered or ran for positions under newly established gender mandates or quotas. We saw that in Cameroon, I explained earlier. So in that case, there was a gender mandate for inclusion, but no numerical quota for women in the executive committee of the Forest Association. However, women picked up 5 of the 8 seats in the committee. That said, women did not just act individually, they also leveraged their collective strength to advance their rights. In Nepal, a women's group provided space in its small building to serve as headquarters of the community forest user group. So obviously enhancing the clout of women. The group also conducted reproductive health, family nutrition, and other trainings and started a microfinance program for women in the community. In Jordan, when the Pasture Association was created with both men and women as members, women were able to leverage their newfound clout to call for the creation of an education council to help with the education of the children in the community. In Mexico, admittedly, the inroads for women in communal land and resource governance have lagged a bit, but some women have started to organize themselves and initiate conversations about ways to open up more senior positions for them in the community governance bodies. So I would say that one caveat is that despite these successful examples, women in the case studies communities continue to face barriers. They still have primary responsibility for domestic activities, creating a double work burden for them, the home and the collective enterprise, etc. They are also often responsible for the bulk of agricultural activities, even if profits are equally shared by all group members. Or a subset of women may be barred from claiming rights. For example, daughters who are expected to marry and move away, thus not given land rights, although they provide labor. Or some may forgo rights due to attached obligations. They just don't have time to attend meetings. Or they are minorities or lower caste women, such as in Nepal, who are in a weak position to claim their entitlements. So the bottom line is that achieving a truly gender equitable and inclusive collective land tenure and governance is a long and evolving process. But certainly women are not standing by idly, but are actively engaging in their empowerment. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, great. Thanks, Celine. Already I have about 100 questions for Eileen and Celine, and I'm so intrigued. I want to learn more from both of you, but we might just head over to Philippine for now, who's also going to share a little bit from some of the work that she's been doing. And Philippine, I have a question for you. Did implementation of the project that you were leading lead you to draw any conclusions about what the enabling environment might require to strengthen women's voices in land governance? Thanks, Philippine.
Thanks, Elisa, and hello, everyone. Well, let me start by maybe saying a few words about the project that I've been implementing with IIED. So I've been leading action research to strengthen women's participation in local governance, in focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, in particular in the context of increased pressures on land, particularly from large-scale land acquisition. And we've been specifically working with local partners in two geographies, in Tanzania and in Senegal. And the starting point of the work was an initial assessment in both countries, which showed that women were rarely involved in decision-making on land, on the use of land, and in the case of investments, when land was actually given away to investors. So for instance, in Tanzania, a study by our partner TAWLA, the Tanzania Women Lawyers Association in Kisarawe in the coastal region of Tanzania, showed that collective land used by women for sacred practices and for wood fetching was given away to an investor who was planning to grow crops to produce biofuels without women being consulted or aware of that. And in the end, there was no adequate compensation for that land being given away. And in Senegal, evidence showed that in areas where, again, pressures from investments were very high, women were completely absent from the lands commissions, which are the bodies in charge of land allocation at the communal level. So to answer your question on enabling environment, in order to strengthen women's voices, to make them able to participate in the way land is governed, what we learned from our action research work is that there is a need for a comprehensive and holistic approach. It's important to work on different fronts. And I think what I'm going to share actually really resonates with what I've heard from Eileen and from Celine. What we found was that there are different enabling factors that are important to enable women's effective participation in land governance, and they can be grouped in 3 broad categories. The first one is that women need to have a seat at the table. There is a need for, that means that there is a need for an adequate legal and institutional framework for participation and for women's participation. The second one is that women actually need to be able to speak out. So for that, first of all, they need to know their rights. They need to be aware of their rights, but then they need to actively participate, which means having the confidence to speak out and participate. And then you actually need, the third enabling factor is the need for a receptive audience. You need a supportive environment so that your voice is heard and acted upon. And for that, that means supportive social norms. So basically having men and local leaders, religious leaders, not being hostile to women's participation, but being supportive of them. In both countries, well, first of all, let me say that, of course, these are the sort of 3 main, the 3 enabling factors, but of course, each context is different, and the approach that you develop would need to be tailored to the specific context, and you might want to put more emphasis on one of these factors, depending on the specific need that the context require. But often you would probably need to actually work a bit on 3 of them. And that's what happened in our project. So we focused on all 3 aspects, but we definitely put a particular emphasis on the adequate institutional framework, which I think is foundational. The other 2 factors, the women being able to speak out and having a receptive audience, will actually have, in my experience, little impact if you don't have this adequate institutional framework. So it's really the foundation. So maybe let me tell you a bit more about what I mean by adequate institutional framework. So that means having a very local, participatory, and inclusive set of institutions which are governing lands at the local level. So what I mean by that is that institutions where community members are really able to express themselves, to air out their concerns, their opinion, to really participate. Then in terms of local, we found out that the administrative level where these institutions are located is quite important. So because there is local and local, and these institutions need to be as close as the communities as possible. So for instance, in terms of the institutional frameworks in Tanzania and Senegal, there's quite an important difference. So in Tanzania, for instance, you have local institutions which are governing land, which are located at the village level. So you have a village assembly and a village council at the village level. Whereas in Senegal, the lowest administrative level is actually at the commune level. And just to give you a sense of what that means, a commune can have up to 60 or 70 villages. So that's sort of quite higher up. So yeah, there is between Tanzania and Senegal quite an important difference. And yeah, in Tanzania, you have what I would say a really good institutional framework. I've mentioned village assemblies. These are assemblies where all village members above the age of 18 can attend. So any villager, men and women, can potentially voice out their concerns on land issues during those meetings. Conversely, in Senegal, so I've mentioned the land commissions. The land commissions only have 7 or 8 members who are elected municipal councillors. So the the connection with what's happening in terms of land governance of on the ground is much thinner. So basically, in what our partners did in Senegal was to support the establishment of consultative committees at the village level and at the zonal level. So this is all under the communal level. And these committees would actually feed into what's happening at the communal level. And another, so I've also mentioned that these institutions need to be inclusive. Women need to be part of the institutions. They need to actually have a seat at the table. That's the expression I've used. And in that, interestingly, Eileen mentioned affirmative action. And the sort of most obvious way to do that is through affirmative action and gender quotas. So having a minimum number of members of these committees being women. And we found that this is actually not a solution per se, but it's a start. So having rules which have a minimum of sets a minimum of women members will then sort of prepare the ground for the rest. But then we found that, so for instance, in Tanzania, there is already a rule on that in the national legal framework. But actually, we found that it wasn't properly implemented. And interestingly, again, like I see it resonates a lot with Eileen's work in Kenya, because the way that our partners found to go around that was actually to support the implementation of local bylaws which were promoting women's participation. So making sure that those norms on women's participation in these institutions were known and implemented. And another sort of important point, which is more on the practical side, once we have these women members, is to make sure that they actually attend meetings. And so it's also important to make sure that these institutions are meeting at times which suit women, that they don't coincide with cooking or caring time, for instance. And also that meetings are publicized in advance so that women can actually organize themselves so that they can attend them. But yeah, that's really the foundational ground. I think the other two key points that I've mentioned are equally extremely important. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Philippine. And Celine, did you have a follow-up question for Philippine?
Yeah, Elisa, thanks for that, Philippine. Thanks for the emphasis on the need for women to participate, and the need not just for strong structural factors, but for how those factors are implemented. So my question in relation to that is, can you tell us a bit more about approaches that can be used to strengthen women's confidence to speak out when they're actually at the table, that they can speak out and be heard?
Thanks, Celine. I think that's where, I mean, I've heard, I think Eileen and yourself have alluded to it, but I think that's really one of the aspects where more robust research is needed. Of course, we can mention the sort of the training and awareness raising, which I think is a good starting point. But in Tanzania, we found that, like, we actually did some monitoring and evaluation on our work, and interestingly, women said they felt comfortable to speak out during meetings, but actually they were not really speaking out during meetings. And so, yeah, there was really a discrepancy there. And I think we really need to find ways to build these women's confidence. So I think we've alluded to role models. I think that's definitely something that should be explored. Another thing which actually has come up, which I think is quite critical, is critical mass, is collective power of women. So having important numbers of women at these meetings, so that and sort of sticking together. So one way to sort of build that we've explored was actually making sure that women could meet together before groups of women could meet together before official meetings to sort of discuss issues and agreed on the issues that they would raise. And I think another point, I think Céline, you've mentioned economic power at some point, and definitely I think this, this can be really an enabling factor in terms of women finding the confidence to speak out. Yeah, I think that's mainly what I can think of. Thank you.
Thanks, Philippine. And I think the last thing you were talking about there is really, I think that's the interesting area that we don't hear about as much, and that is once you get past having a seat at the table, having numbers of women who are on committees or on in governance bodies, then it's a matter of whether women have the sense that they can set the agenda, that their needs rise to the level to be included in those committees or in those governance bodies. And I think that's something that came up. Celine mentioned earlier that we'd worked together on a case study from Cameroon. And I found that was one of the interesting takeaways that I had from that, was this very inclusive process had been developed. Women were in leadership positions. Women and men both said that women have the right and do speak in these committees and in the governance groups. There was no restrictions that anyone felt. But when asked about how the funding that was coming from the forest revenue, how the funding was being spent, all of women didn't even feel that they could raise their concerns about how the money should be spent. So the money was all spent on things that men were interested in. And when we asked the women kind of like, why didn't you, I mean, you're a leader in this group, why wouldn't you have suggested something that you wanted? They just said, we didn't think that was the kind of thing we could bring up at this group, because women were interested in having, more clean cook stoves, solar powered for their houses so that children could study later at night. Their interests were different. So I think that there is something quite interesting there about what needs to happen so that women's needs and interests have equal weight and value, and that they know that their needs and interests have equal weight and value in those governing bodies. And I think that each of you have kind of alluded to different ways that you might help to support that to happen. But I think that's another kind of interesting angle on all of this work, particularly when looking at decision making. And so I thank you all for your presentations so far. We did say that we would open up the floor to questions and answers from the people who have attended, so they don't have to hear from me all the time, although I have many questions. Katie, could you let us know if there's a question from the audience that you could present to the panelists?
Yeah, we have a couple, and I think one hand up at some point, but maybe not anymore. The first one is from Ojong. Hi, Ojong. And she asks for Eileen, have you had cases where the paralegals in their quest to ensure women are not left out in land registration and bylaws get harassed? How are such situations managed?
Thanks, Ojong. I think that's an interesting one. The discussions around inclusion of women in membership are very heated conversations. In fact, in some cases, paralegals get stuck in trying to help communities understand why this is important. The covering is that there's a clear legal provision. And so because communities feel threatened if their land is not registered, there's a quest and a desire to go through the registration process. And so if the registers are not inclusive, it means when they submit them to the community land registrar, then she or he will decline to process their registrations based on that. The other thing that somehow, doesn't necessarily cover them in totality, but remember these paralegals come from those communities. And even when there's a pushback, there's less harassment. But of course, the pushback is definitely there. But because they come from that community, the paralegals are either someone's relative. Communities are pretty close and very, like really close to each other. And so harassment is minimal. I think more often than not, harassment comes when they're dealing or pushing back in, investment projects and so on and so forth. But definitely it's not the easiest of conversations. And especially, we are battling with a number of things now within the registration of collectives. We're seeing trends that after communities register, there's still pressure to move and privatize the land into individual parcels. And so one of the questions that's being asked by communities is, if we include everybody, including all these women, and then we get to a place where we want to subdivide and everybody gets a parcel, then because we'd have so many people as members, it means at the end of the day, we'd have just a small piece for each of us because we've included everyone, including the women. And so that brings such heated discussions. And because we say we're not trashing, we want to create place for dialogue, conversations, where communities question some of those issues themselves and hopefully get to a conclusion. Sometimes not always the most progressive conclusion, but at least even being able to create space for that discourse itself is helpful for the work that we're doing.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. Katie, do we have other questions from the participants?
You do.
Lisa, before we move on, is that all right if I just chime in very quickly?
Please.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think maybe I can share some experience we had in Tanzania in another project that we did a few years back. One way that we went about the project is to work with the district government, get their buy-in. So this was a project to try to pilot more gender-sensitive village bylaws. And so we worked with paralegals to help, organize the community to start, those without bylaws to start developing their bylaws. And because ultimately the bylaws will have to be approved by the district government. So we started with them and saying, this is the intention, and this is the paralegals will be the main channels for organizing the community. So we made the rounds from the district head, the district land officer, to the village officer, the village secretary, just so to at least they may not have full buy-in, but you'll expect less harassment because they know that there is support for this person at different levels. So that was one strategy that we did. I just wanted to put that on the table.
And thanks for raising that actually very important question, because sometimes people are putting themselves on the line by, even if it's a small challenge, but by challenging the status quo, the individuals can be putting themselves on the line. I think it's really important that we recognize that and talk about how we can do things in a way that ensures people are kind of protected in those efforts as well. And I know that this is something that comes up quite a bit too when we think about, we often talk about expecting women to assert their rights to land, and not thinking about the personal cost that can come to them from doing that. And I know that this links to gender-based violence and other things that we don't talk about so much in our work on land, but it's a big feature of what drives people's behavior as well, right? There's always that potential threat. So thinking about how we do that and the sensitivity that we apply to that and who we involve along the way at different levels, at the hyper-local level and even at the more levels removed is really critical, I think, to ensuring the broader backing for what's happening. And it sounds like Philippine, you wanted to add to this too. Is that right? You used your hand. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes. No, actually, I wanted to share a lesson which I think is also quite relevant, which actually stems both from my work in Tanzania and in Senegal. The fact of actually not approaching initiatives on or presenting initiatives on women's land rights frontally, if that makes sense, with communities, but actually presenting it, and not just presenting it, but doing it as a project which also supports communities as a whole. So for instance, in Tanzania, the bylaws, which in fact WRI and Celine initiated, and then we did a lot of work on that. There are provisions on women's participation, but there are lots of other provisions. And I know it really resonates with Namati's work as well. Provisions which are benefiting all community members. And in fact, in a previous phase of our work in Senegal, the approach was openly really focused on women's land rights, and we really sort of got a backlash from men and from village leaders. So for us, it's really important that the focus on women's land rights is embedded into a wider inclusive approach, which at the end of the day benefit all community members.
I think that's a really important point, and it can be, I think, sometimes difficult to talk about in these contexts. But it's the reality. I mean, I think as well, if we keep our eye on the ultimate objective, it's whatever pathway to get there, right? And like whatever messaging, however you need to approach it to get to that ultimate objective. But yeah, it's true. Sometimes talking about rights, even if it's not ownership, even if it just using the word rights can be very distancing. So you have to come up with other ways of kind of framing things so that the people who are ultimately incorporated in this aren't threatened by it. And it is a community-wide change that we're seeking. So I think it's really important to think about what's going to resonate with the community to help you achieve, to help you achieve the kind of ultimate ends, which is kind of improved well-being for everybody, right? Philippine, were you going to follow up then, or should we move to another question? I saw you took.
No, please, move to another question.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Katie, do you want to send one?
Yeah, the next two both involve engaging men, so I'll just kind of combine them. The first one was specifically to Eileen, but I think can apply to everyone's work. So first one, how supportive or not supportive were the spouses or men in the family for women's land ownership? And then the next one is, what strategies are you using to engage men to support women to own collective land?
Right. Who wants to take a first stab at that one? Eileen? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, besides the dynamic around the potential of subdivision or privatization, we've seen progressively men embrace the importance of this, because the narrative that we've been driving is we're not talking about any women, we're talking about it's your daughters, it's your sisters. So that sort of brings it home, and then being able to identify champions. So even among those indigenous and local communities, there are progressive men that are appreciating the importance of this. Some of them are men of authority, or respect within the community setup. And so sometimes men, want to hear it from one of them who they consider of higher authority or some sort of respect. And so we're also identifying some of these champions within the community and supporting them in cascading the message and in, kind of the evangelism in bringing more people to appreciate why this is important and the overall benefit at the end of the day. So progressively, yes, a bit of pushback, definitely. We also use some of the role plays, and it's very interesting to see, role plays and how that plays out in the different setups, when women are included, when women are not included in the outcome of it. And those role plays tend to sit, when they sit back and internalize the role plays, is always a kind of an aha moment. And so that's some of the approaches that we are using in terms of trying to engage men in the process.
Great. Celine and Philippine, do you want to add to that?
Well, actually, the points I was going to mention were very, very similar to Eileen, I think. So I'll be brief, but I think, yeah, you can't assume that all men are going to be against, or you need to identify the ones who are actually pro-change, and there are some. And if there are leaders, of course, it's best. And then, yeah, the other point is we've been also working with role plays in Ghana, actually, and we found it quite effective. So I think, yeah, for people to step in somebody else, a woman's shoes can be sort of kind of mind changing, or also to engage men on, putting themselves in their daughter's shoes, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah, I can chime in as well. So again, I simplified my examples earlier, but I'd like to add a little more detail to the Jordan example. It's a tribal Bedouin community where actually women are not allowed to work outside the home. So they have the primary responsibility to graze the cattle and the goats, but that's not considered working outside the home. That's part of domestic responsibilities. So they graze, the men handle the money, everything. So this was the project by IUCN. It's actually a project to revive degraded rangelands. And with the recognition that because women were primary grazers, they knew about the landscape. And so how to get around that very strong custom of women not allowed to work outside. And so what they did is a national women's NGO, the Arab Women's Organization, volunteered to conduct the gender sensitization campaign. It was a year-long campaign, and they started with the tribal leader because the tribal leader is respected by the other men in the community. And secondly, to help convince the tribal leader, they approached this very senior woman. Apparently, she was a bit well off on her own. She inherited money, and so she had some influence. So those two people, together with the Arab Women's Organization, actually went house to house and said that, why is it important to include women? It's because they know about the landscape. And how did they get to this collective enterprise? The community was really suffering from drought. And there was lack of fodder for livestock. And so they decided that there's, these little shrubs can be used as something that an NTFP, a non-timber forest product that the community can sell to help earn income. So, that sort of resonated with the men because most of the households were financially hard up. So the women having the opportunity to contribute financially and just staying within the community, getting shrubs, and processing it and selling it. And then when the women started earning and bringing home the bacon, so to speak, men started opening up. And that is not to say that women became the leaders. They still sit at the back during meetings. They don't say something unless they're asked. But some of these customs are very deeply rooted and entrenched, and it will take a long time. But there's some steps though. So it's again, women have started to gain more confidence. As I mentioned, they asked the formation of an education committee for the children in the community. So again, economic empowerment and livelihoods component is a very strong, I would say, incentive for opening up or shifting mindsets. The other example I would give is, as Philippine and Eileen alluded to, are gender champions. In the Mexico case study, so there's one woman who blazed the trail, sat there, the lone woman, non-speaking in those General Assembly meetings, until some of the women eventually trickled in because they didn't know what was going on. They were single women. And they don't know what benefits they could have from the community enterprises, until there's this one municipal chief who decided announced that all women should be invited. And he had a very practical reasoning. It's not rights-based at all. In fact, he said, we have problems in this community. The women need to contribute to solutions. And so that was the entry point. It wasn't, at this point, it wasn't really economic incentive. It wasn't women's rights, but you need to help in solving this problem. And so that started, the process. Again, it's not perfect. Women are still at the backseat. They don't control the agenda, but the space has been opened. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. I mean, I think one thing that comes out from what all of you have been saying, and I think Philippine, you may have mentioned this in your comments, is that having a very holistic approach is really important. And I mean, it makes sense, right? It's common sense in the sense of, that's how we operate as humans when we organize ourselves to work with each other and in families and in communities. It's how we live. But very often, when talking about women's rights to land, there's very narrow ideas of what that means and what it will take. And I think that one thing that comes from what you three panelists have been talking about is really taking the big picture view of what's needed, but also kind of what's possible, and also how to bring about change. And I, for one, am very interested in hearing more from you all. But I think we need to wrap up today. And I just want to say a few closing comments just about next steps. First of all, a huge thank you to our panelists who've given their time to share with us today. It's so rare that you have an opportunity to hear practical details of what people are working on. And even between Eileen, Philippine, and Celine, we know each other. We've been talking about these work for a long time, and yet this is the first time I've heard about it in detail from you all, because we don't really have the chance to do that. So if we're talking about creating spaces, sometimes I think we need to create spaces for those of us who've been working on change to really share like what that means and what that can look like, and spread the word as well that change is possible and being worked on, and that it's not this huge mystery, that it can be done, and can be done in a way that's really fruitful and helpful. So my big thanks to you all for sharing with us and spending your time with us today, and to all the participants who joined us to listen in. Just to finish up, a little reminder that everyone who's registered for the event will receive an email with the link to the post-event wrap-up page that'll be on the Resource Equity website, but there we'll have the video of the panel in case you want to look at it again or share it with your networks, as well as all of the resources that were referenced in the chat and bios of the participants in case you want to dig a little deeper. If you're interested in hearing more from our panelists and more about some of these strategies in much more detail, we're running a short intensive course in early 2023, and you can go to resourceequity.org/institute to register your interest in joining that course. And if you have any questions or comments from today's webinar, please email Kirsten at institute@resourceequity.org. And we'll also put you in contact with the panelists as well, if that's what you'd like to do. So thank you again to everyone for joining us today. This panel will somewhat be repeated next week. We'll have a couple of our speakers will be with us next week on a different time zone, and we'll have some other panelists joining. And so if you want to tell more people about this, feel free to do so. Thanks again to everyone, and I wish you all a pleasant evening, day, morning, night, wherever you are. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.